Hi students, this is your instructor for Creative Writing 240, Nick, and in this video, I'm going to cover 5 conventions of fantasy and sci-fi writing that I want you to think about this week. If you haven't watched the weekly video, the week 2 video, I highly recommend that you do that first because I will give an overview of just everything you're going to go through this week. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about in this video will make a lot more sense once you watch that other video. Again, that one called the week 2 video. This video is pure content. So if you have a notebook, I'd highly recommend getting your notebook out. If you don't have a notebook, I'd open up a Google Docs page, take notes as you go. You can always refer to these slides. I'll post these slides on Moodle as well. And then in our in-person class, I'm also going to go through this same slideshow on Monday. And so there should be ample opportunity for you to go through this. But I just think taking notes is probably the easiest way for you to do it. And the reason I make this video and go through these conventions is because it's really easy for us as people to pick up a piece of writing and that we enjoy in particular and just naturally start reading it without much of a thought as to what some of the conventions of that story might be or what the genre might be used to. And I want you to kind of think of this from a sales perspective as we started. If you're someone that really likes reading sci-fis, you like that genre for a certain reason. There's a consistent thread running through this one to this one to this next one, and that consistent thread brings you back. And so while it's always good to take risks in your creative writing, and I really encourage risk taking, I think we also need to just be probably aware of what are the typical things. Now, 5 is too small of a number. We could spend 2 weeks covering the conventions of fantasy writing, and then honestly, the whole class could be fantasy sci-fi writing. The whole class could be mystery writing. The whole class could be modern fiction. We could have just picked one genre and just studied it to death. That's one way to teach this class, but I really want you guys to kind of get like a buffet platter, so to speak. And so I boiled it down to 5 very common conventions of fantasy and sci-fi writing. While you'll probably think to yourself a lot, no dur, my guess is you're probably going to think about fantasy and sci-fi with a little bit more clarity once you see me speak about these conventions. It'll be really obvious once I do share them. You'll be like, oh yeah, I knew that. That's why I don't like sci-fi, or that's why I love sci-fi. That's why I love fantasy stories. You'll instantly know it. But yeah, grab your notebooks and we'll get into it. So as we talk about fantasy and sci-fi writing, the place I want to start is with setting. You'll notice I put certain words in all caps in this slideshow, and I think that's what you should take notes on. In this one, it's setting and imagery. The setting is where a story takes place, and it can be real or imagined. Typically, fantasy stories are imagined. And the reason I start with setting rather than anything else is because if you are going to create an imaginary space, and you're going to then create characters that inhabit it, and you're going to ask your reader to picture it in his or her head, you need to be really good at constructing a place with words. You have to be really good at taking something that you can picture and somehow helping another person picture it. Let's say you come up with some vivid and beautiful place for your story to take place, and you give it one sentence. And let me give you an example. I've gotten this before. Once upon a time, there was a town with a lot of mushrooms in it, and da-da-da-da-da. Right? That's a silly example, but I've gotten that type of sentence. That was it. That was the only setting on the sentence, or the only sentence for setting that I got. And I was supposed to be able to picture all these other things, but the person literally only was picturing like this enchanted village and they had like this haunted house. And the only thing they said to lead me there, though, were the mushrooms. And I was just like, what in the world? This is seventh graders, so I guess I should cut them a little bit of grace. But they're picturing this rundown town with an abandoned building at the end of it, and these colors that were just dark and earthy, and worms and stuff like that. And they just told me there's mushrooms. Didn't give me any sort of direction to picturing it. So in order to actually create your settings really well, you're going to need to master imagery. And I'm sure you studied imagery in like seventh grade. So this is probably very, very old. But you need to learn to show, not tell. I don't really want too many linking verbs in your writing. Words like am, is, are, was, were. Those are linking verbs, and those just tell something. I much prefer you to show me through imagery where your stories take place. The smell of blank was in the air. The character looked up the hill and saw ... Green and blue, like give me the colors, right? Give me the smells, give me the textures, give me the tastes. Giving that imagery is going to help your reader picture where your stories take place. And like I said earlier, since you're imagining this, it's really, really, really important. If I am picturing a grayscape, it's just a character and kind of just this blah, because you've given me nothing, I'm not going to finish reading your story. It's going to be boring. So setting is the first thing. And I really think, in fact, setting is like such a big deal that I wanted to just kind of throw out this quick little note on setting, that because it's so important in fantasy and sci-fi, you use imagery like I mentioned earlier, but then you're gonna need to continually build the setting. You don't just start and stop, right? Anytime there's a setting change because characters are moving, you need to rebuild the setting. Or for example, if we're picturing a town and there's mushrooms on the ground and the houses are falling apart, and maybe there's like an ominous wind that's blowing through and a very odd smell of like a metal smell. I'm using this imagery if you can picture it. Everything's dark, and yet it seems like the sun is shining, but it seems darker than it should be. The trees are pale, and there's a house at the end of the street. Okay, so that's my first exposition, right? That's my first explanation of the setting. Well, at some point, the characters are going to go in that house. And when they go in that house, I better get that same level of detail about the interior of the house. If you tell me there's a house on the hill, and at some point you don't tell me what's in the house, and that house is not an important part, I'm going to be very let down. And that will be counted against your grade, right? One famous author said, the gun that is written about in chapter 1 should go off by the end of the story. Right? If you're going to include a detail, make it relevant, please. So don't just create setting that matters. Create setting that has a purpose. And to do that, you're going to probably need to spend about 1 to 3 paragraphs each time you have a new setting. So your initial setting, 1 to 3 paragraphs, and then anytime you get a setting change, 1 to 3 more paragraphs just to build that setting out. And I want you to look for that in A Sound of Thunder this week. That's your Writer's Lens assignment, is reading A Sound of Thunder like a writer. Read it like a writer and diagnose it. Be critical of it. Sound of Thunder has great settings, 2 really great settings to be exact. And the author spends, like I said, 1 to 3 paragraphs on each. So, all right, let's go on to the next convention, the next principle. Because setting is so important, the setting needs to be balanced with the characters. Your characters need to fit into the setting somehow. And the go-to example of this, obviously, would be Lord of the Rings and all of Tolkien's stories. He creates this amazing setting based off of his childhood countryside home called the Shire. And then he introduces these characters that fit the Shire perfectly. If you've never read Lord of the Rings or never watched the movies, Just know that the Shire is this beautiful rolling hills expanse where everyone gardens. People are quick to mess with each other. It's kind of a fun-loving society. They're quick to give each other a hard time. They live in these little holes, these little huts, kind of like moles do, but they're people, so they're bigger. They're more sophisticated. They love cleanliness. They love things to be in order. They hate dirt. They love a big meal after a long day of work. The Shire and the hobbits, the people that inhabit them, are meant for each other. They're built for each other. When Tolkien created them, he created one out of the other. I'm not sure which direction. But he either created hobbits and said this is the type of place they will live, or he created the place they would live and said this is the type of people that would live here. That's what you need to do with your characters and your setting. If you create the haunted mansion, something about your protagonist or protagonists needs to fit with that mansion in a way. Or if you're taking place in a sci-fi, you always have these super nerdy characters in sci-fi because we're in this hyper advanced world of rocket ships and space travel. And so of course, like, the character's average IQ is going to be way higher. If we've been able to figure that out, then they're going to be super smart. So you get characters like Spock, right, who's fitting this mold with characters matching the setting. So think of some other examples from stories, but you'll find in sci-fi and fantasy writing, the characters pretty much always match their setting. And that leads us to our next point. Oops. Oh, excuse me. I'm going to go out of order here. The conflict component. I'm going to jump to number 4. You can write it as number 3. I'm going to probably reorder these slides. In these stories, in sci-fi and fantasy, the conflict, right, that would be the problem that a protagonist faces, and that makes the story interesting. The conflict typically exists as a tension between setting and character, right? There's this uncanny link between the setting and the character not all of a sudden having balance. I'll go back to Lord of the Rings since that's the example that I used earlier. But the ring in Lord of the Rings represents this corruption, and all of a sudden the guy who has the ring, Bilbo, starts no longer fitting in. Okay, he starts no longer fitting in with his people, which is why eventually he runs off. And this happens in chapter 1, right? This is the very first thing that happens. He stops fitting in, and he runs off to live with others, to live with the elves in Rivendell. And that ring that he leaves behind to his nephew, Frodo, he pretty much says, figure out what to do with it. I don't know what to do with it. I can't have it anymore. And of course, the ring's trying to draw itself back to him. The ring is a character, and it's very evil. It's the embodiment of evil, and all of a sudden, he doesn't belong though. And then in the same way, once Frodo gets the ring and needs to destroy it, he realizes the only way to destroy it is for me to change settings, for me to go to the place it was built. In other words, in order for me to destroy the representation of evil, I have to go to the place where evil is abundant. Mount Doom is what it's called. Crazy naming conventions. Mount Doom, that's really creative, right? So you see this tension between place, character, and conflict. That's what creates our story's interesting components. In more sci-fi level kind of things, a lot of times it's looking like planetary destruction. Or if you look at like Marvel movies, it's destroying half the people in the world. Thanos was a big motivating conflict, right? Because he realizes that the world cannot sustain itself, so he has to destroy half of it, right? That's the theory. And there's this sort of conflict that exists because places are not in harmony with their characters. Okay? It's really common. Do I have another thing? Sure. Yeah, I do have one more thing on this conflict. Then I have to go back to number 3. There's always multiple types of conflict in stories. There's always lots. Good stories have lots of conflict. And I kind of want to make it easy on you guys. Take notes on the external, internal here, right? So there's 2 types of conflict and you can break the external conflict into more parts if you want, but conflict is either external or internal. I remember learning man versus man conflict, man versus nature, man versus supernatural, and I had to like write that down on a quiz. Yeah, sure, like those are legitimate conflicts, but in reality, there's external and there's internal. There's something a character faces that's outside of them, and then there's something the character faces inside of them, like a lack of courage or a lack of belief in themselves, right? Or if we get into the modern fiction genre, typically internal conflict is the main conflict. But these external conflicts are what really matter in sci-fi and fantasy. I personally love internal conflict. To me, the most interesting stories are the ones where a character is struggling with themselves in some way. But fantasy and sci-fi really focuses on the external. I think this is why I'm not a huge fantasy sci-fi guy. Like, if I'm just being completely honest, like take for example Lord of the Rings. Like I really do like Lord of the Rings, and I've used it as my example a lot for fantasy so far because it's kind of a hallmark fantasy. But like, let's be real, the antagonist is terrible. Sauron, just this malevolent evil guy. What's his motive? What's he trying to do? It's completely, I would say, unnatural, right? Just wanting to take over the world for the sake of taking over the world is not, in my opinion, good conflict. And yet, so, destroying the ring and going to battle and like all this stuff that they do is really propelled by that conflict created by the malevolence of this evil person. I'm just kind of like, that real? Rings of Power only made it worse too. I don't know if you've seen that, but it like ruins everything. But so you get these characters that are good, and then they're bad, and the good characters are going against the bad characters. There's not that internal conflict component. And what ends up happening, again, this is why I don't like fantasy and sci-fi quite as much as other genres, is you get a lot of static characters versus dynamic characters. I love dynamic characters. Dynamic characters exist because of internal conflict. Static characters, they don't change, right? That's what the static character is. For those of you who aren't sure what that term means, you need to write this down. A static character is a character that never changes. They start a certain way and they end a certain way. A dynamic character is a character that changes through the progression of the story. And now I'm not talking about physically. Like, physical changes do not matter. Physical changes does not make someone static or dynamic. I'm talking about what someone believes changes, or the way someone sees the world changes. That's what makes them dynamic. And I think those are really, really good characters, right? I think dynamic characters are by far my favorite. Again, that's the problem with Lord of the Rings. You have an evil character who's just evil for the sake of being evil, and you have these good characters who just once good, always good. Now, Frodo obviously is like getting corrupted or whatever and needs Sam's help. But is that really a big part of the story? Not really. The external conflict is always way, way, way more important than that internal. So same thing with like Star Wars, Star Trek. Same thing with, I guess, your less popular fantasies and sci-fis as well. You just get these characters that like they grow up in a really hard circumstance, and now they have the heart of gold, and they go and fight evil, and the evil doesn't know why it's evil, and the good just happens to be good, and we root for them. For me, it's a tough sell, but it's a common thing here. This is a convention. So think of your Marvel movies. There's like 2 or 3 total dynamic characters. Oh man, that's why I have a hard time with Marvel. And I guess I'm just sharing all my opinions on popular media right now. Iron Man is a dynamic character. I think he's the best character in the Marvel series by far. But his dynamic moment happens in the very, in Endgame, the very end of Endgame. And he changes an ideal, right? He's all about himself. He's super selfish. He's only looking out for himself this whole story. And then at the end of that, he changes his mind. And I'm not going to ruin it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but he's selfless in the end. That's an example of dynamic character. But in fantasy and sci-fi, typically, most of the characters are static because most of the conflict is external. I hope that makes sense. Okay, I gotta keep moving. Let's go back to point number 3. Point of view matters a ton. Because these stories are more imaginative, it is so critical that you pick the right point of view to tell that imaginative perspective from. So, point of view, as a reminder, take notes on this, is the perspective from which the story is told. And there's a lot of different types, but the most common 3 are first person, which is when the narrator is a character in the story telling you the story from their perspective. Therefore, they're using words like I. Right? I saw this, and then this happened, and oh my goodness, it was crazy, but I was able to survive because of blank, 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 or whatnot. Third person is an observer, and third person has 2 types. There's limited and omniscient. Third person limited is this observing and reporting idea. It's a character in the story, or maybe a narrator outside the story, who is telling you what they see and hear, but isn't actually able to reveal the inner thinking of the characters. And because that's typically focusing on one character's arc. Okay, one character arc. This is not super common. Typically, third person omniscient is where people go. You either go first person or third person omniscient, honestly. Certain from the perspective of a narrator who doesn't just observe and report, they know and report. Like, they know all. They know the inner thoughts. They know the inner struggles. And they know the secrets, right? If there's a secret, they know it. So they can tell you about it. The omniscience in the narration allows them to shift between lots of different characters, include inner dialogue, struggles, and all of that. It allows for a good amount of dynamic character development, but first person is typically where you get your best dynamic character development. Yeah. But let me give you a few examples. So first person, I just love this passage. This isn't fantasy or sci-fi, but I had to use it. First person, this is from Catcher in the Rye. The main character and our narrator is Holden Caulfield, and here's how the story starts. If you really want to hear about it, the first thing you'll probably want to know is where I was born, and that's intentional. It's not supposed to be it's what my lousy childhood was like, and how my parents were occupied and all before they had me. All that David Copperfield kind of crap. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. So this is first person narration. He's telling you his perspective, quite obviously. And when I say you, he means you. He literally is referring to the reader here. The first thing you're gonna want to know, since you picked up this book, is all about me, what my lousy childhood was like. But I don't feel like going into it if you want to know the truth. This is modern fiction, and I love it. He knows he's narrating. He's controlling the story. He's telling you what he wants to tell us. He tells us what he feels like telling us. And because of that, we have to question, is this narrator even reliable or not? He's a character. He has limited information. And he has the free will as the narrator of the story to tell us whatever he wants. It's beautiful. Third person omniscient. This would be your more popular technique in your fantasy and sci-fi writing. Third person omniscient means there's that narrator outside of the story who can see everything and tell you. So here's a paragraph that shows this. This is kind of towards the middle of the first chapter. As for Bilbo Baggins, even while he was making his speech, he had been fingering the golden ring in his pocket, his magic ring that he'd kept secret for so many years. As he stepped down, he slipped it on his finger, and he was never seen by any hobbit in Hobbiton again. So the ring is a secret. That's how I know he's omniscient, is the narrator is in on a secret. This means the narrator could not be a character, right? The narration could not be told by a narrator who's in the story. It couldn't be a character. So the narrator here positions him or herself as the author of the story, or as Tolkien would prefer, like in interviews and stuff, he would prefer it to be viewed as someone who's telling the story a long time after the story took place and all that secret information was spilled. Kind of like you're at a campfire and you're telling. Okay? Because he's omniscient, he can tell you the inner thoughts and the inner struggles of the characters as well. I think I'm probably getting close to my time limit for my recording program, so let's keep moving. Very final principle for fantasy and sci-fi writing is that theme is not as important in this. And I think some people in their middle school and high school creative writing experiences, theme is harped on so much that it's probably weird for me to tell you don't focus on theme. But it's really important you don't focus on theme. When people write a fantasy or sci-fi story, they're typically doing it to entertain. Their point behind it, their reason for taking the time to write it, is to entertain. They have an imaginative idea that they want to share, right? This is probably more true for the traditional fantasy and sci-fi stories. There are more that are coming out that are really focused on theme, but in general, they are not trying to teach you something like an Aesop's Fables or Kids Fantasy or a dystopia, for example, is all about theme. While fantasy and sci-fi can teach a lesson, that's not the main reason that the author spent the time to write it. So Star Wars, it's kind of about dark versus light. Harry Potter, kind of about good versus evil, or evil within oneself, or overcoming evil, overcoming hard circumstances, maybe. It's not really fleshed out a whole lot. Lord of the Rings kind of teaches about good versus evil, and some people like to make it about agriculture and industrialism. But I just really do know most of these authors are very, very quick to tell interviewers, I did this to entertain. I did this to share a story. I had a great idea and I wanted to share it. I had an imagination that I had to get out of my head. So don't get caught up in trying to teach a lesson. That comes later. It might happen naturally in your story. Great. But there's other genres will focus on theme. Okay. I hope that makes sense. Probably like a little bit weird, like don't focus on this. But that's just how fantasy and sci-fi function. If you really want to try to make theme a central part of your fantasy sci-fi story, here's how you would do it. You would, going back to some of our other principles, you'd really want to do first person. First person is how you develop more theme. Because by going first person, you then emphasize inner conflict. Okay? You emphasize that internal conflict I talked about earlier. And when you're focusing on internal conflict, you get to pick your theme at that moment. What is the internal conflict that the character's struggling with? Then, at some point in their story, they have to overcome that internal conflict as part of the climax of the story, would probably be my guess. And they have a dynamic moment, they change, they become a different type of person, and that becomes your theme. That's how you typically would do it in fantasy and sci-fi. If you want to try that out, go for it. Typically, though, a lot of times people just go for entertainment value. So, yeah. All right, this is a lot of information. Hopefully you took good notes. I want you to then apply these 5 conventions. I want you to look for them in Ray Bradbury's Sound of Thunder as part of your writer's lens assignment. And then for your trial right this week, I want you to really pick 1 or 2 of these to hone in on. Probably setting, honestly. Setting and point of view. Pick a good point of view. Pick a good setting for me. Okay? If you can do that, you'll be well on your way to writing a fantasy or sci-fi. Pick a good setting. Pick a point of view that allows you to share how you want to share. And then develop some good characters that are in balance with the setting. Don't worry too much about theme. Okay? Then get to your conflict. That'll come a little bit later. But your conflict will put your setting and characters out of balance. That's how I do it. Hopefully that makes sense. Probably getting close to my timeline on this video. Get started on your writer's lens would be what I say do next. While it's fresh, use your notes. It is Sound of Thunder, great time travel story. Kind of has a theme. Maybe not so much a theme. It has more of a quote at the end. The butterfly effect. Yeah, so hopefully this helps you understand fantasy and sci-fi a little better. All right, see y'all.